conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Happy Mother's Day, Jess.
Thank
a couple
you.
days early here, but you're a great mom.
Thank
Good
you.
job. And to my wife and my mother, also great mothers. Happy Mother's Day
Yeah.
to you. A couple days early if you happen to listen to this, or late if you listen late. So,
That was really
Do you
nice.
got any other moms you want to shout out? Just like to say Happy Mother's
That's
Day
true.
to
Yes,
your
to
mom,
everyone who
if you're
is.
listening.
a mom. If you're a mom that listens to this, we really do appreciate it. Hopefully it's valuable.
Even if you're not a mom,
We love you.
there's your flowers. Yeah. Happy Mother's Day. good.
Happy Mother's Day to Austin's wife, who
Danny.
is,
Oops.
a mother again. So
Doxing
we're excited
people
about
here.
that. So I'm not saying where she lives or anything.
Just sharing all of people's information.
Sorry, Austin.
Did you clear that with Austin? That
I didn't.
People wanted
I didn't
to.
say name. Okay.
I accidentally did.
Maybe he doesn't want everyone to know that he's having a baby.
He looks
Well,
mad.
Austin wants everyone to
shoot.
know everything about him.
Yeah, he's.
He does not look happy. He's not even looking over here.
We'll
he's-
find out.
Oh, okay.
He'll let us know.
Mm-hmm.
And Christina, who's also an awesome mom.
Yeah, happy Mother's Day to my lovely wife. Thank you. It's a good reminder. Yeah. So what's up other than moms?
Yeah, it's been a while since we've been in these seats. Those people might not know that, that listen, but I was gone for a couple weeks, so that was exciting, but missed you all. And it does remind me, like, when we do kind of get ahead on the podcast a little bit because maybe one of us is gone or things like that. I really do enjoy this. Like, this is usually an exciting part of my week to have these conversations, to sit down with you all. My time with a free therapy time with Jess from City Care.
I keep getting bills, but I just throw them in the trash.
Yeah.
And we just get to
Yeah.
bask in Eric's awesomeness.
Yeah.
That's
so,
really what it is.
Oh yeah. Thanks.
So I missed it.
Alex agrees.
I'm like,
I was looking for the voicemail at this point. Sorry.
Oh, do we have a voicemail?
We
this
do have
week?
a voicemail.
Oh, good. Thank you, voicemail person, for saving this segment of the podcast. We always need you to save it, or
Hey,
we'd still be.
podcast team. This is Adam,
There it is.
former high school ministry resident. I just have
Oh,
a quick question about finding and building community. I'm part of a life group, quote unquote, that is home to several couples from a lot of different churches. And I was just wondering what your opinion is on finding community outside of a singular church, or if it's better to group everyone together from one particular place. Just would love to hear your thoughts on finding and building community there. Thanks.
That's a great question, Adam, because I think it's probably not, you're not the only one asking that kind of question. Especially, I think churches, we want people to be involved in community. If you've been around Christ Community Church, you've heard us probably say community is our middle name, and really try to press people into community groups. We've called them journey groups and things like that. So I think that's an interesting question, especially for people that are Christian, that would find community in multiple different avenues and places. And sometimes it feels like maybe a specific church is saying, unless you're in our blessed or our specific community, then you're not maybe doing life right or doing the Christian community stuff right. And so I could definitely see how a question like that could be pondered. What are your thoughts on that question? If I'm hearing it right, it's
I'd like to hear your answer. I don't think you really gave an answer.
I didn't.
think you
I was trying to hear your
okay.
thoughts.
can you reframe the question?
I think
what
what Adam's asking is, he's a part of a community group or small group, for the lack of, because we use weird words. He called it a life group that has people that are members. So it's a Christian group,
Got it.
but people are members of several different churches or attend several different churches. But this is kind of where they find community. Versus, like, I'm a part of a community group that is all people from Christ Community Church, which is more maybe the standard how churches present it. And so I think he's asking our thoughts on that.
I think it's what is community for you? So like with where maybe you are in life, what does community look like? Does that look like, obviously we would think like being involved in our church, probably being around people maybe that are the same age as us. We kind of have like this norm that we think about. And I think a lot of churches are really good about mixing it up. So you could maybe be in a group with different ages and people at different places in life. I think that we kind of limit what community looks like and maybe need to be a little more open-minded about it. So to me, it's interesting to hear about groups that are like this, where it's like, oh, maybe this isn't the norm, but you're finding community, you're finding like-minded people, people that love Jesus. And that doesn't always mean people that maybe love Jesus that are sitting next to you. I think there's like pros and cons if that's what we're talking about. But I think overall community, it's being mindful of what do you need and what type of people are you surrounding yourself with, and are you in a community that you can be vulnerable and have accountability and openness.
Yeah, I think sometimes when you listen to just the churches, I mean, I'll use the term propaganda, but I don't mean that in a negative context. I just mean the way that things are delivered to you or spoken to you, or what you're told to do when you're part of a church, or how you're engaging. It's not always meant to be as prescriptive as maybe we hear it all, but it's like, this is like, you're trying to cast a net for the lowest common denominator. So you're saying, hey, this is the best way for you to plug in, but that doesn't always mean it's the only way for you to find community. And I think people would be, when they look at an organization and like a church, or even a big organization like our church, I think you would think, okay, well, they are going to want to be protective of what their people are doing and how they're engaging in community and who that's with. And the ideal situation would be for them to be with people in the same faith community. But I mean, I guess I work here, so I'm not not a spokesperson, but I'm also not the one probably who would be the community group spearhead. But I do think, man, if you're plugging into any faith community that's helping you grow, we'd be remiss to say that's a bad thing. Like, I don't think the church would ever consider that a negative thing. I think anywhere that you're growing and you're finding community and you're being challenged and you're sharpening one another, then yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I get to lead. We have 101, which is like kind of like new people onboarding, like, hey, what's CCC all about, and all those things. And so there's 4 different weeks of it, and you've probably heard, if you've been around here, on a Sunday, we try to get people plugged in so they know what the life of the church is. And so we lead week 2 of that, which is about finding your place in community. And yeah, I mean, I say essentially that same thing. Like, one of the things we try to do is, like, community is essential in the Christian life. Like, God made us to be people that are a part of community, like Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's part of being made in the image of God. And so we want to give people on-ramps for what that community looks like. But there's seasons where, like, man, being in a traditional, quote unquote, small group where and by that I mean probably you're talking about sermons, you're, doing a lot of the follow-up on, hey, we talked about this week, and there's a certain discussion guide and all that's centered around that. There's, certain seasons where it's like, no, that's not the best step of community for you. It's maybe finding one of our renewal groups, because you've got things happen in your life where grief share is the most immediate best next step for you to find community of people that are going through the same things, or community of people that have some of the same life experiences. That we've talked about codependency and some of the groups that have been created by that. And so even inside of that, we would not say this is prescriptive to be, if you're not in a community group under that specific label at Christ Community Church, then you've failed. But we would say, you should be in Christian community. You should be in a place where iron is sharpening iron, where you're able to talk about things in an open, honest way about what's happening inside of your life. And so we want to be able to provide those spaces as a body of Christ, as a church community for easy entry into that kind of community and remove as many barriers as we can and provide most of those. But for some people, like the choir at Christ Community Church has been this sustainable community where they gathered for decades every Wednesday night and they shared meals together. They, sang together, and then they would gather again on Sunday mornings. And so there's so many different ways to find community of people that are like-minded, hopefully pushing you towards Jesus. And so I don't think that's bad. But I would also say to a person, if you're a member of a church, you should be contributing or finding ways to be contributing to the mission. I think God gives each church kind of its unique DNA and fingerprint that he's called them to, that they can affect maybe a location in their city or affect, certain things that God has called them to that are unique. And so you should find ways to be involved, I think, in that unique DNA and fingerprint of a church and contributing in some way to your church. And being a part of community is one way you can contribute, but not the only way. And so I think that's important as well, not to just, kind of be scattered and not really walking towards the same mission, maybe that if you feel called towards that specific church community. But it's going to be crazier and crazier. I think we're going to hear more of this in the future as people are deconstructing what does it mean to be a church? What does it mean to be a part of the body of believers? Are we doing it all right? And so I think you'll see more and more of this, and so it's a good question for people to wrestle through.
There you have it. Hopefully we answered your question well. Today on this episode, we are going to be talking about tradition. And, is it good, is it bad? All those good, fun things, pros and cons. Be sure to stick around for that. As mentioned before, today we're going to be examining the pros and cons of tradition, talking through what it means, all the different forms of tradition. This is kind of inspired by a viral video that was going around where a mother was, sharing something that her son said to her. And people, everyone has their hot take, right, when something like this goes viral. So, Alex, I think you have the clip. Let's play it real quick so people can hear it.
My son just told me that tradition is just peer pressure from dead people. Wait, that makes sense.
There it is.
So if we were to define tradition, it's the transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, or the fact of being passed on this way. So by that definition, is tradition just peer pressure from dead people? Can we answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I get the notion,
Yeah.
obviously, like as you play something like that, that's so quick. And again, we talk about this all the time. Like anytime you have a word or something that's trending, there's probably this initial, oh yeah, that's right. But then the more you look into it and I guess process what that actually means, the more you're like, okay, there's nuance to this conversation. And like I can see how somebody would say, I think especially like biblically, I think you hear this argument a lot of times that like the Bible is this old archaic book written by a bunch of dead people and it's not evolving with current culture. And so we're serving the traditions, whether that be around sexual ethic or several different kinds of ethic around, marriage and divorce and a lot of different ethics that are taken from the Bible. And we're like, should we be listening to the words of dead people, dead cultures? Obviously, we believe it's inspired by God, and so that would separate it. But I have heard people maybe not say it like that tradition is peer pressure from dead people, but use that same kind of argument around the dangers maybe of tradition.
Jess, what do you think? Do you think it's peer pressure from dead people?
I think that if I went up and we didn't have the what's the Webster's definition of tradition, and I just said, Eric, what's tradition? You would not have repeated it to me as the transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation. Mm-hmm. Like you would have had your own hot take on that word. And same with you, Alex. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's very interesting how I mean, it's more interesting to me that someone's child is interpreting it that way. So I'm just like kind of processing that.
Yeah, I think it is nuanced. It's always nuanced, I guess, when we have these conversations.
Yeah.
But I do suppose it depends on the type of tradition you're referring to.
Right.
Whether it is, like Alex mentioned, biblical tradition, if it's personal family traditions, if it's other types of religious traditions. There's that kind of old adage or parable or whatever you want to say that I've heard it over and over again, but it's it's like 3 generations of women, mom or grandma, mom, daughter, whatever, and the mom is cutting off the bottom of the ham before putting it in the oven in the pan to cook it, and then the daughter asks, why do you cut the bottom of the ham off? And then she says, I don't know, that's just what grandma always did. And then grandma looks at her like, well, that's the only reason I did that is because we never had a pan that could fit the whole ham. So we had to cut it off to get it to fit, and so it's, to me, that's like the form of tradition that can be a little more, maybe not harmful, but it's kind of like having your parents' religion where you're like, well, why do you believe in Jesus? So I don't know. I guess I grew up in church. So my family said was the right thing to do. And you don't even have your own faith. You don't have a relationship with Jesus. You haven't internalized scripture. You haven't taken the time to study for yourself to really know what you believe. And so I think there are forms of tradition where it can almost feel like that. It's not necessarily peer pressure. I think peer pressure is something that kind of has to be bestowed on you from your peers and a living thing, but it is, I could see why you would make that analogy.
Yeah. And that seems like that's, that type of tradition that you're talking about is like just meaningless tradition, or a tradition that you have no real reason that you're doing it, no real answer. And I think for a culture more and more that's doesn't want to just be subjugated to because I said so when they're asking questions. So a tradition that is like, well, just because it doesn't really have a lot of point to it, doesn't really have a lot of backbone to that type of tradition, then of course it's going to be easily dismissed as like, well, Dad, why do we do this? And if you have no real good reason for it, then it's kind of dead, lifeless type of tradition. But I do think, and tradition, it is everywhere. The more I thought about this, right. I think of course, I think of Nebraska football, right? And so like I was a kid, like the same age as my kid, and Nebraska was amazing. They had this awesome, they were just awesome. They were like one of the best teams. And my son, like I wanted that for him, and I want to try to educate him based off of like the tradition of Nebraska football, why I love it, but he just doesn't get it. Like when he's living through like, these people don't ever win. Like I go watch them lose every time. Like it's hard for him to believe in, and I can't just sell him on the tradition of Nebraska football, And so I think whether it's sports, religion, it's so many different things. Superstition, I think, even comes into like some of the traditional kind of conversation as well. Family customs.
Well, I think even like family careers, or family business. Your grandpa was a doctor, farmer, policeman. You insert career path. I am that also. So son, you should probably pursue that career. And I think that does almost feel like peer pressure from a dead person, because maybe grandpa or great grandpa or whoever is dead, but yet the living parent is kind of through them pressuring you to be like, no, this is the path for you. This is the path that was laid out for you. You hear of people now turning down their parents' business. The parents are going to leave them this inheritance and they don't want it. And that seems ridiculous to older generations, but I don't know. I guess the thing, as a parent, you think of the things you want for your kids, and I would never want them to be forced into something that wasn't fulfilling for them or didn't bring them happiness. So
is that when a tradition maybe becomes a bad thing, when they feel forced and it doesn't bring
I think so.
happiness? Because I feel like there is like this this place where it changes.
Yeah.
Where it's like we've always done it this way, but then when there starts to be pushback, that doesn't feel comfortable. And then that's kind of starts resentment. Maybe I was forced to do something that didn't feel right to me, but then me passing it down, that's like also passing down resentment. Well, now we have to go do this.
Yeah.
Like, how am I
it's
passing it down?
even something like circumcision. Like, it's like,
Yeah.
you know, I know when we had a kid, you kind of didn't even think about it because it's like, oh, okay, well, you know, as far as I know, everybody in my lineage was, so I guess that's just what you do, right? Like, you don't. So, I mean, there's just a lot of those types of things. And maybe, you know, maybe we look further down the road. I know there's already pushback on that now, saying that is harmful and you shouldn't do it. So it's just, I mean, it's just one of those things. I don't know. I think with new information, I think that should always educate our decisions. But, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most tradition, I mean, obviously, the Bible is one of those places where we're going to find a ton of tradition. I mean, and a lot of stuff that even is celebrated today, like a Passover. And, you know, a lot of tradition was to help people not be forgetful people. And so, like, the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, talks about the fact that you're supposed to, you know, teach your kids. Always be teaching your kids when you're on the roadside, when you're going to bed, all of these things. You're supposed to be teaching your kids of the goodness and the faithfulness of God, and the delivering power of God. So Passover is this idea that, you know, that happened way back in Egypt where there were the plagues and God delivered his people. And the final plague was, you know, people, you know, putting blood over their doorposts, and this angel would pass over, and that would be the symbol of God's deliverance of his people to this promised land that they would eventually have. And so there was this tradition that was built on honoring and respecting and having reverence for God and not forgetting where God had brought you from, because I think if you forget where God has brought you from, you forget, you know, in your life of his goodness and his faithfulness, then it's easy to begin to have a tough moment in your life, or to not see God's faithfulness or God's goodness inside of your life. And so I think in Scripture, that's one of those places where we see over and over traditions kind of being set up that are also supposed to always serve us. And so I think in the church, a few of the traditions maybe that we have are rituals. You know, maybe we would call them like. I
think of communion.
Communion is one of those things. I think the tradition of praying the prayer before your meal, you know, my kids could probably have the prayer that I have memorized. And is that prayer good or bad? I think it's indifferent, but those things are designed to serve us. They're designed to serve our spirits, our souls, to give us times to pause and to remember these things. But often I think where tradition starts to fail is when we begin to serve it. And so, you know, a lot of times you can go do communion and it's designed for us to like just pause and remember God's faithfulness, his goodness, the sacrifice on the cross, to confess, to be able to say, man, I'm flawed, and God, I need your grace to wash over me, or I need to at least be reminded of your grace again. And man, it's a powerful thing when we go into that tradition and we let it serve us, but it's meaningless and lifeless when I go into it just because I'm serving it because it's tradition, and I forget the meaning and the depth behind it. And so I think
when it becomes religion, in a lot of ways,
it becomes stale at that point, you know. And there's ebbs and flows where I forget the beauty of the tradition, that I have to be called back to, you know, why is this there? And I think it's always okay to act like it, something that should stand the test of time. You should be able to question and ask, why is this there? And I think that's where it's good to have some of those traditions or to break some.
Well, you bring up, I think, praying for meals. And I think that's a tradition. I mean, I grew up with that. That's what you did. You said thanks. You know, we weren't hand-holding family, but you prayed for every meal. And my dad, being the very outgoing evangelistic pastor that he was, I felt like we always prayed a little louder at restaurants than we did at home. But maybe that was, I don't know if that was intentional or not. But I think that's something I wrestled with as I was older, because I realized, to me, there was no meaning behind it when I prayed for a meal. Like, I just did it because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. And so I wrestled with that a lot, because I'm like, why am I doing this? Am I actually thankful for this meal? Am I like, am I just going through the motions because I think, or is it something where I'm like, oh, okay, as a good Christian, this is me holding up a pillar of Christianity, and I need to do this. This is part of my obligation as a Christ follower, is to sit here and pray for this meal. And I think either way you look at it, those are kind of disingenuous reasons to pray for a meal. And I mean, at what point are you saying God's name in vain when you're just doing that out of habit because you think that's what you're supposed to do? So it's like, how do you, and I think I struggle with that too, because like, you're right. Bestowing that onto your kids is giving them a reminder of to be thankful. But how do you balance that from what I feel like I experienced was like, okay, well, and maybe that was just my own understanding of it at a time, but I grew up to a point where I'm like, oh, this almost feels meaningless. Like it's not connected to my relationship with God.
Right.
You know?
For me, you just modeled like incredible like reframing and mindfulness of what tradition is, because it's like you're stepping back and you're questioning like, why am I doing this? This is how I feel. This is how it could come across. And that's where I think like authentic, genuine traditions that are healthy and positive passed down, when you're questioning it and you're saying, does this fit? And what does this look like? So praying before a meal might have looked like super loud, or maybe like you said the same prayer, but it's like as it's passed down, you have the opportunity to also add into what it means to you, or maybe like correct something in it. And so I think like questioning it and being mindful of how it comes across and how it came across to you is exactly what we should be doing. Because the other thing I'm thinking too with the spiritual side is that traditions are made to make us more comfortable to do things. Like if I experience communion as a tradition often, that makes it easier for me to communicate what that means to me and to somebody else and invite them into it. And so I think that there is a lot of good that can come from being familiar with it. But I also think, it's the whole mindfulness of why am I doing it? And what does this look like to me? Because you're responsible for other people at some point, whether it's your friends or your kids, of how you communicate that.
Well, and I grew up hearing a lot of people saying, go to your prayer closet, right? When you're going to pray. And I don't know if that was a Pentecostal term or that was, whatever, maybe other churches used it, but it was this thought of, no, if you're going to pray, you need to be reverent to God. You need to find a quiet place without distractions. You need to be serious about it. And that always felt so, religious and rigid to me that I never felt like I really experienced the quote unquote relationship with God, because I thought that it had to be this formal thing. And so I think as you start to navigate that stuff for yourself and understand that, hey, at any moment, anything happening around me, anything, I can say a prayer, I can talk to God, I can be in that space. I think that was formative for me to understand that, because I always thought it was just these sacred checkpoints that I had to set aside and go, okay, when we eat, we pray, and I go to my prayer closet or whatever that means, and it's just, or at church, we pray at these certain moments. And I think understanding that tradition and the good parts and then the bad parts maybe is pretty healthy.
Do you think having that tradition helped you moving forward feel more comfortable doing different things when you, like, did you take anything with you from that
Which tradition
experience?
specifically?
I just think like the prayer closet or expectations that you had.
For the record, I never had a closet that I prayed in, but it was a term that I always heard.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was like, how did you like carry on into your adolescence, adult life? How did that transfer?
Yeah, I think, even this whole topic, for me, I'm probably going to address it or face it a different way than other people, because I do have a contrarian spirit about me a lot of times. So it's like when I am told that this is the way you do something, I just naturally kind of rail against that. Yeah, I'm asking, why is that? Why is it? And that's served me well a lot of times in my life, and it's also hindered me. So it's just, I guess it just depends on how you look at it. I think some of the more traditional stuff made me be a better chameleon when I needed to be in religious circles. But I didn't always care to understand why we did things the way we did them,
Yeah, and I think that's especially where in the church world and, quote unquote religious spaces that it can get sticky, these conversations, because one, somebody that really is dogmatic about how something should be done, or maybe they've had an experience with God where, the like quote unquote having a prayer closet or a place that they needed to get away was, man, God really met somebody there in a deep, powerful way, and they're unable to separate like that prescriptive way that God met them there from, like that's the only way, that's where they tangibly have had experiences. And so then the danger can be when we overlay like our experiences on other people, because other people have different learning abilities or different learning preferences and learning styles, or for whatever reason, maybe ADD, ADHD, like there's just personality traits that might lead somebody to not, needing to be removed from distraction for that to happen and have intimate like moments with God. I remember, working with middle schoolers, and, anytime I said, like we'd be closing a service or whatever, I'm like, all right, we're going to bow our head and close our eyes. And I want you to know there's no magic in this, but we are just distracted people. Like the reason that you bow your head and you close your eyes is like, just so you can not focus on everybody around you. Like you can have not your eyes on what your neighbor's doing and all of that, and have your hands, folded, is like, it's just a posture of like, I'm not distracting my neighbor and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, like why I do that is because I just get so distracted. Like if I see a noise or if I see somebody moving, then it's going to distract me. And so I do that because it just helps me focus a little bit better on God. But then there's times where like, man, the best thing I can do in prayer is like look at God's beauty, or like be looking at a room and just see how other people are responding, reacting. And so having that, kind of setting some of that precedent was always something I wanted to do with middle schoolers, to say, hey, like here's some of the reason behind it. Here's why we're asking you to do it, and not just do it because it's what we do, but to kind of set our hearts on why that might limit some of the distraction in your life. I remember, at the church, when you're 100-year-old church, you're always going to be, I think, fighting the balance between tradition and progress. Yeah. And that's just probably everybody in our lives. But, like there were people that were super passionate about the pews, when we removed the pews from our worship center, and there were people on both, maybe sides of the argument. I don't want to call it an argument, but on two different perspectives, on, people are like, well, man, I met Jesus there. Like I can point to the Sunday morning that I walked in, like I was having a conversation with someone a couple weeks ago, like they can point to like the Sunday morning that they walked in, a broken mess, abuse, a lot of things happening in their life, and they can point to the Sunday, to the spot that they were sitting in the worship center, and the way that God rescued and spoke to them and redeemed their life. And so like it was really in their heart this sacred space. And for them, every time they went and were in that same spot again, there was just some kind of liturgy that would just set their heart ablaze again and remind them of that moment that they walked in there and how God, met them. And so it kind of created this sacred space for them to meet with God. And so, they were sharing like, man, it was a difficult move for me because that was just, it was just a space that I can't explain of how I met with God. And so I'm like, I can empathize with that. Or people that are like, I watched my grandma, in this room, not be buried, but play organ or whatever. Or I walk down that aisle. Yeah, and it reminds me of my vows. But so I get it.
I think the argument there can be made, though, that's where tradition is a barricade to progress, and it's a barricade even to the gospel to a certain extent, and it can go both ways because, I mean, there were no pews in the early church. Yeah, there were, it's even like the King James translation. I mean, grew up, that was the translation that we read, that we studied, that was the one, and again, it's sentimentality, because this is when you met God, this is how he was talking to you through this book. You were reading it in this translation. And so I think when you meld sentimentalism and traditionalism into this kind of boiling pot of whatever that your upbringing or your however you've experienced your faith, then it's going to guide all of that. And then to you, that is going to be why you do it this way and why you're going to pass that on to your kids and expect them to do it. I mean, as a parent, that's one of the most challenging things ever, when your kids aren't encountering God the way you think they should encounter God.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. It's upsetting. It's frustrating on both ends, because you think, this is how I did it. And if you don't take the time to actually see where they are encountering God in their lives, you might miss it. And then you'll just say, well, you're not doing it my way, so you must not be doing it at all. And I think it's just really dangerous. I think when the church does that, that's really dangerous. It's not, because God's going to meet people and the Holy Spirit's going to move and convict people however he wants to do it, in whatever scenario, in whatever setting that he wants to do it. And so when we think that because we've manufactured something based on tradition or sentimentality, that we're going to affect this stuff and we're going to produce salvations and it's going to be a product that we can control, it's just a really dangerous place. And so I think sometimes progress is looked at negatively because it's change. But I mean, like I said before, we're not doing anything like the early church was doing it. I mean, other than very, very fundamental things, right?
Yeah.
Teaching the gospel.
Yeah, teaching the gospel. And I think things like communion or things like...
And fellowship, yeah. But communion was even so different,
but
right?
Yeah,
like
different.
we've turned that into this like commodity, like it was, they had a meal together, It's so different.
But that's
In
why
baptisms,
it's so difficult too, because emotions are involved, whether they're positive or negative. It's like you have feelings about how something should be and expecting someone else to buy in without communicating or them experiencing what that should be. And I'm thinking more of like what you're talking about, like progression of like maybe changing the physical
spaces
of a church versus like questioning communion. But
music's a big thing too for people.
And so I think there's a lot of people that aren't heard when people like they feel like they're not heard when they're like, this is how it should be and we should be going this way. There's just like these emotions involved. And that's why I sometimes feel like traditions is like, when it comes up, it's like, okay, walking through mud, because it's like, it feels very much like slow progressing, because you have to create buy-in from an older generation and a younger generation. And I think that's why this is a relevant conversation to have too.
And I think it's really important to understand that, because there's probably worship songs from the late 90s that I can hear right now that would probably get me to a place of feeling at least emotional. I don't know if it's a spirit thing, but I know I would feel emotional, because it would take me back to those moments where the presence of God felt so fresh and tangible to me, that I don't experience it in the same way. And I think it's the same for older generations. And so when there's hymns and these songs where this is where they met God and it means so much, I try to have empathy for that as much as I can. And I think that's important, because we all have preferences and stuff like that. And there's all traditions that I think of recipes. I remember when I first got married, I would try to get my wife to make everything like my mom made it. Like, oh, you're doing that wrong. You got to make it like this. Eventually that led to me cooking most of the meals, but that didn't work. But it is one of those things where sometimes is it tradition? I think there's certain traditions that are very good, but sometimes it's more about having it our way. And it's not VK.
Yeah. And again, I think so much of it, like for me, as I've pondered it, is like, am I serving it or is it serving me? Like I grew up in a very much non-traditional church background. No liturgy, no Lord's Prayer every week. A lot of the things that we would consider liturgy. And I kind of was almost baffled and thought that was all archaic. And the more I ended up working at a church that had a lot more liturgy, and I appreciated that time to learn that a lot of this liturgy connected not just me to other Christians inside of, this building, but it connected me in some kind of mysterious way. And I think there's some mystery to some of this,
Sure.
to Christians of thousands of generations of Christians, that even in the ritual of baptism, that I'm connecting and identifying not with just Christ Community Church or any of those things, but I'm identifying with like the church at large, and doing an act, a ritual that has been done by millions of people, and somehow like I'm identifying and connecting with people from multiple generations and countries across the world, and this global thing. Like one of the things we got to do a couple weeks ago was get baptized in the Jordan River, and there was nothing miraculous about this. It was nasty, dirty water, and the same water Jesus was baptized in, yada, yada, yada. And I don't mean to like dump on any of that, but the coolest part of it was, and it was frustrating because it was kind of like a commercialized, setup.
Like Disneyland of
like
baptism.
Almost, like you've got a time and you have your reservations.
Check in.
And all of that. And I kind of went into with this posture of, okay, this is like so commodified, and Jesus would just be flipping this upside down. And yet then there was this part of me too that was like, it was our group of a bunch of people from Omaha, Nebraska. And then next to us was this group that was from somewhere else in Africa, speaking a totally different language. And then a couple bays over, there was, another group from, somewhere in Latin America speaking. And so there became this beauty, or this moment, of like, wow, this is like so cool, that this is a bigger thing than just like this Americanized tradition that sometimes we do serve, and we've got to do it right. And, you've got to dunk yourself under for, like, there's so many weird things we've done to baptism, like infant or sprinkle or full submersion, or this is the age regulation, or this is that. And so like in that moment, like a lot of that just left, all the regulations we put on it. And you're like, man, but
How did that feel?
it was just cool. Like I was kind of frustrated going into it and wanted to have that experience for myself. And like I had been baptized, so I knew it wasn't like any kind of like, this is a first decision kind of moment. It doesn't like discount my moment where I first went public, with that. But there was just this special moment of like, oh yeah, this is so much bigger than Christ Community Church or Omaha or Nebraska or even American culture. But it ties us to this beauty of every tribe, every tongue, every nation bowing before the King of Kings. And probably all of us were doing it a little differently. But there was just this beauty, I think, inside of that. And so
the act of baptism is what was connecting you. You know, everybody at some level or another understood it.
Yeah.
In spite of their language barriers and everything else. Yeah, it's really cool.
And I know that. Like that's all knowledge that I have that this is happening. But just having that experience was just like, it turned on a light bulb maybe in a unique way that I hadn't had before. And so I think, again, being a part of there's so many things that I learned being part of a more traditional, maybe, church culture, more high church, that I just learned to have a deeper appreciation for. But then always went back to like, well, every year there was just families, we did confirmation at that church. And so every year there was families that just, they get their third grade Bible. That was something they did there. And then it's like, all right, peace out. We'll see you guys again in 8th grade. We're not going to have church as any part of our family tradition until we have those moments that kind of keep, and that was always frustrating to me, to be like, well, no, this is a lifestyle. This isn't just like, so we check all the boxes in our religious duty. And so those are some of the drawbacks of it clearly as well.
Well, some of them, go ahead, Jess.
I was just going to say that I think that tradition can also be exclusionary or feel exclusionary. And I'm not just talking about, I know we've used a lot of religious references. I think I'm not just saying that. I'm saying across the board. I think it can be exclusionary when maybe we're a part of something and someone's not explaining it to us. So I think that there's a part of that. And then there's also pressure to have tradition. I remember when I got married that somebody's asked me, what are you going to have? What traditions are you going to have? Like, what traditions are you going to do? And people now will even ask my kids, like, hey, what's your tradition at Christmas or when certain times of the year come up? And so I think it's a natural part of our culture. And I think lots of cultures have experienced it, have them in different ways. But there's pressure to have it. And so to some degree, I don't feel like I can be like a traditionless person.
Yeah.
Because I think it creates some connection, obviously, as we've talked about and shared. But there is a fine line of, I think, going back to what you said earlier, of just like reminding me to be mindful of why am I doing the things I'm doing. And just because someone has done it before me doesn't mean that it's the right thing. And that sounds progressive, me saying that. But I'm genuinely saying, like,
Yeah, it doesn't always
right.
mean it. And I think it just goes, beyond religion, there's so many things. I mean, you look at the Chinese tradition of foot binding for girls when they're born so that they would have smaller feet to be more attractive for marriage, or have female genital mutilation in certain cultures, things like that. These negative things, but then on the positive side, you look at like the farming industry. They continue to learn things that date back centuries ago, and they continue to learn from those things. And it's like, if we were to just throw everything out every generation and start from scratch, we would be nowhere. We would not progress. We have to learn from what happened before us. And I mean, that may be somewhat stretching the definition of tradition, but I do think there's a lot there, a lot that people can learn from in those scenarios.
Yeah. And so I think where we probably all live in, probably more on in our daily lives more than we even recognize it, is that we live in this place where we hold those two tensions. Like what traditions should we be upholding and keeping and are worthy of continuing on, and what things should we, progress and maybe stop? Where do we say, okay, that had its, let's have a funeral for that one, and let's keep moving on, because I think there's so much of that, and you don't even realize how much of like a work culture is based on tradition, or how many rules. Like, you're like, why do we do this? Like, why do we have this rule in place? And it was like,
oh, I don't know. We just always did it that way.
And so I think that's why having a posture that's able to question these types of things is good. It doesn't mean someone's like just throwing out everything about it, and having a place where we're like, no, I'm humble enough to give you an answer and to wrestle through this, because I think that's where some of the frustration can certainly come into play, is when somebody is so fully dogmatic about a tradition and yet they don't even know why they're doing it. And then it just creates like conflict. It creates a lack of trust. It doesn't create clarity, and it doesn't keep people moving, forward in a good way, And so I think that's like, I live in that tension probably more than I even realized, in my own life, of like, why do I tell my kids to do this? I don't know. I just was told, to do that, as I was growing up. But then you look back at things in the Bible like Leviticus, which we had a fascinating series about, and the more science like prevails, the more you're like, man, a lot of like the ritual cleansing stuff that happened, that God was giving these people in the book of Leviticus to save his people, literally save their lives from disease and famine and a lot of those things. And so they were wisdom principles that God gave them that preserved an entire nation and moved them away from former traditions or traditions of other countries and people groups that they simply don't exist anymore because of famine, because of disease, because of a lot of those things. And so you're able to look back at some of those timeless traditions and like, man, God used those.
I went to see the Mario movie with my family, and one of the things I noticed in like every trailer, there was a common theme for the upcoming movies that was specifically being marketed to kids, and every one of them was kind of this theme of go your own way, be your own person, do your own thing, don't succumb to, your family's traditions, pretty much, and it was, And to me, that was kind of interesting. And I didn't know if it was a sign of old age or what, but it kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. I'm like, well, wait, why are you forcing this on kids so much? Because it's not that that's all bad. I think there's a lot to learn from that. I think growing up and, moving away from your parents or separating yourself from your parents and maturing in that way, and there's a lot of importance there. But I do think you kind of have to hold fast to certain traditions and things like that. I think they're important, and I think the next generation coming up is going to value not having tradition or moving away from that and saying it's all bad. But again, it just comes with nuance and understanding and balance and talking through things and understanding. I mean, I mentioned farming earlier, but even the medical field and things that we've learned from, like, Alex is saying in Leviticus, but, things that we've learned from different herbal practices and stuff like that still continues to be effective to today. So, yeah, again, it's balance, it's understanding, it's learning and educating yourself. But, yeah.
And being meaningful. I do weddings, and like there's obviously traditional vows, but anytime I do a wedding, I'm like, I'll do the traditional vows because I think it ties you to your grandma and your grandpa did those. But I'm always like, I want you to write your own, because thousands of people have made that same oath and given that same vow with very little meaning. Yeah. Like, I want you to, if your mom and dad gave the same vows, I'll, for the sake of tradition, I'll do that. But tradition and just doing it because everybody else has, I want you to, what are you committing to this bride, and what are you committing to this groom that you're not just repeating lifeless words, but how are you breathing life into it?
Well, it just made me think of, like, even when I was a kid and I'd say that my prayer before I go to sleep, I don't even know if I could remember, but now I lay me down to sleep, pray the Lord my soul to keep if I
die before
I wake. Yeah.
Pray the Lord.
That prayer, I would say that every night because I was like, that's what I have to do, right? And it developed this complex where I started to believe if I forgot, I'd wake up that next morning and be like panicked, like, oh my goodness, I woke up. Like, as a little kid, I'm living in fear that if I didn't, that was the understanding of God I had at that moment. Like, if I didn't say this prayer, I might die. And so it's like, that's not a healthy thing for a child to be sitting there, lying in their bed and fearful that God's going to kill them in their sleep because they didn't say that prayer. So it's like, how do you balance that? How do you pass down that tradition, but also give the context and the understanding and the grace and all of that other stuff that sometimes even a child needs to know.
Well, even in that, I was just reading an article, I don't remember where, but it was talking about how millennials in particular, young and old, are sentimental and adding more sentiment to ideas and thoughts that their parents had. They're now, as adults, putting structure around it. This made me feel a certain way, and I feel sentimental about that. But then what does that mean for me? Yeah. And then sentimentally passing it down to their kids. And so I just think that that's also part of it too.
Yeah.
That we're adding on to what's coming down, and we're kind of creating a lens for the next generation too.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think it's important to, especially at least in the Christian faith, to separate sentimentality and superstition from, and even religion to a certain extent, from our faith, because a lot of times that ends up, they all get melded together, and sometimes we don't know where sentimentality or superstition or other things like that kind of end and our actual faith begin, and we meld all that together like a big bowl of spaghetti.
And it ends up in a lot of ways taking an infinite God and putting him in a finite box. And like, we just, it's never good for anybody to take something that's infinite, and our minds are finite. We're never going to be able to exhaust who God is, but tradition in a lot of ways, especially when wielded negatively, can put God in this finite box and actually keep you from experiencing the fullness of God, because you've wrapped him up and put him into this box of your denomination, your expectations, all of that. And so, but at the same time, it can keep you in line and progressing and having a daily relationship with God. And so I think asking those questions and inviting the Spirit into it.
Yeah, that's good.
As always, is good.
All right. Well,
Is it peer pressure from dead people? Yes or no?
you know what? I feel like I just will say yes.
I think
gonna say it is.
I was gonna say I feel like we've proved that it's too complicated to just say that.
No, I'm just gonna make it
I'm
easy
saying
for
no.
people. Alex say no.
It's very complex.
I'm gonna say Jess is in the middle.
Oh,
It's very complex.
yeah.
What do you
Here I
say?
am.
I'm just saying. Yep. It's.
Well, what do you guys think?
I just said
We
it.
just said
No,
it.
I'm talking to the
I would-
I'm
Oh,
talking
yeah.
to the
Listeners.
uncomfies.
Yeah, the uncomfies. Let us know.
Uncomfies.
Yeah, if you have questions, concerns, or you'd like to tell us what you think, go ahead and send us a voicemail to 402-885-9930, or you can reach out to us on social media on Instagram and TikTok at CCCOMA Podcast, and you can still, as always, send us an email. That's podcast@cccomaha.org. But until next time, we'll talk to you then.